Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program created in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Dr. Irfan Khan, founder and CEO of Circuit Clinical, one of the largest integrated research organizations in the U.S., and the creators of the Trial Scout clinical trial platform.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have Dr. Irfan Khan from Circuit Clinical here today, and we are going to have a great discussion with him. Just a few NewYorkBIO things. My name is Jennifer Bland. I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. I wanted to give you a few updates. Obviously, this virtual breakfast series is a little different than we've done in the past. We've moved our small format breakfast with key opinion leaders online, and we're grateful to be able to do that because we're grateful to connect with you and also to be able to hear from some of these leaders in ways probably that we wouldn't have been able to if we were trying to do this in Manhattan on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. A few things that we have coming up for you. We're going to be doing this breakfast series regularly, so we've kind of blocked Tuesday morning 9 o'clock to feature a series of leaders across New York and the country as we move forward. And then a few things, as most of you know, our annual meeting was postponed, originally scheduled for March 10th, and it had to be postponed due to coronavirus. And so our current schedule is September 14th. Our fingers are crossed, our toes are crossed, our everything is crossed that we'll be able to do a meeting then. We may not know exactly what it's going to look like. We may have a hybrid of online and in person, but we'll be working obviously with not only officials as far as what the regulatory requirements are, but with you all as far as your comfort level on attending the meeting before September. Another large event that we do, which would be our second year, is an emerging company showcase in partnership with the New York Stock Exchange. We still plan to do that. It will no longer be May 11th. We're targeting a date in late June, so we'll obviously keep everyone posted. Historically, we have had that combined with a reception on the New York Stock Exchange floor, so we're hopeful we can still do that. It is a pretty big floor. Hopefully we can still have cocktails and socially distance while doing something like that. In addition to our breakfast series, we're also working to bring you conversations with both state elected officials and federal elected officials from New York. So we'll be keeping you updated on those and let you know when those are scheduled. So those are some things to put on your calendar when you see them in our newsletter. And lastly, just sort of some housekeeping. Obviously, this is a Zoom webinar format. You can see us, we cannot see you, but you can ask questions. At the bottom of your screen, there's a chat and a Q&A. So you can actually submit questions or thoughts in either place, and we'll be able to see those. And either we or Irfan will, if they're questions for him, we'll be able to help respond throughout the conversation. I think those are the main housekeeping things. And Irfan, I'm going to actually turn it over to you to introduce yourself to our community, and then I'll let Derek kick off the questioning after that.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. Morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Irfan Khan. I'm a cardiologist and a principal investigator for a long time, trained in Cleveland, came to Buffalo years ago. And about 5 years ago, we started working on a project to decentralize clinical trials by bringing them out to a network of physicians who hadn't done it before. So that was the beginning of Circuit Clinical. And from there, we ended up developing patient engagement software. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
You timed the end of that very well for my sip of coffee, Irfan. Thank you.
I was waiting.
Well, listen, it's great to have you here. And as we have a few things that we can get into today, but I think one of the things that would be really good to kind of frame the conversation is maybe give everybody a little bit of an overview of what Trial Scout is and what it does.
Sure. About a year and a half ago, we started working on a plan to simplify what the patient experience looks like online when looking for a clinical trial. So thinking about it from the perspective of a patient or their loved one who had been given a diagnosis and just wanted to know if there was a clinical research care option as well. And if you go online and try that now, what you see is that it's a difficult road. You usually end up on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a really important warehouse. It does a real service, a real public service. It's just not really a patient-oriented interface. And so it doesn't answer the questions patients want. It shows people a list of trials in medical language. And that's often the end of the search, And so inside Circuit's team are the founders of Health Grades, Dave and Carrie Hicks. So Carrie was founder and CEO, Dave was the founding CIO. And the three of us sat around talking about the experience of how hard it is to find a trial for people who ask you to help out, and the utility of changing what that experience looks and feels like. And that was the beginning of rethinking what the search experience should look like. And maybe you could answer a different question, which is, where do I go? And what do people like me think about that? So really putting trust and transparency into that process. And so, the nice part of that was that we weren't using brand new invented from scratch ideas. We were simply taking the best of West Coast companies who think about how do you build consumer engagement, and how do you build consumer willingness to sort of share their opinion and create that voice and amplify it. And that was the beginning of Trial Scout's idea around recasting what the search result was, showing people where to go near them, and then giving them the opportunity to see 5-star rating and reviews from people just like them. And so that was Trial Scout's origin story. And from there came the ability to answer very interesting questions about the patient journey in clinical trials.
Got it. So how did you fall into this? So you were trained in Cleveland, and you had come to Buffalo, and had you ever thought of starting a company? What was the genesis of, what was the why for you? How did you fall into it? How did you get into it? What was really the driving factor?
Yeah, I spent 10 years in Cleveland. I did medicine, cardiology, cardiac electrophysiology, so put in pacemakers and defibrillators and burned out short circuits. I was lucky enough to come to upstate New York, to a hospital that didn't have a full service EP program at the time. So coming right out of training, had the opportunity to build a program, and that was just a wonderful experience. Terrific people. It's a Catholic health system hospital, so great mission. Everybody gets care. It was terrific. And so from that, brought the experiences I had at Case over to Cleveland over to Buffalo with clinical trials, and things were going great. And about 5-6 years ago, my dad was wrestling with a Parkinson's diagnosis, and I'd watched trial after trial fail, and I was thinking about the process and thinking that the next era of clinical trials is going to need a faster, simpler, cheaper way to engage the people who actually could speed the development of new medicines, the patients themselves. And so that really became the contribution I thought I could try to help make, and put the team together and try to bring clinical trials into the places where the patients really are. The number that gets moved around all the time that is very compelling to me is that only 3% of patients participate, only 3% of physicians participate in clinical trials. Functionally, that means only 3% of us really have good access to it. And what's concerning is that when you look at the physician polls, less than 3% say they would refer a patient to a research program if they didn't personally know the institution or the physician, which means that functionally 95% of us have no visibility into clinical trials. And I don't mean patients out there at some sort of nebulous other class. I mean you and me and Jennifer. None of us have this kind of visibility into it as a care option unless we're lucky enough that our physician happens to be connected to that particular study. So there's no other good equivalent in the modern world, right? We can buy shoes from Japan and have them here, well, now probably in a month, but used to be a few days, right? So in that world, it's strange that something happening in your own city may be completely opaque to us. And so when we list out the troubles with clinical trials today, they are all the second order effects of that problem, that it is difficult for a patient to make their way to even understand the opportunity, to think about it, and then to actually connect with it.
Okay. Yeah. And sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
I was going to say, so have you drilled down to figure out why the physicians don't feel comfortable helping research? Because clearly if they have the personal connection, then they're willing to funnel their patients right into a trial. But it sounds like that there's a gap there, right, with the patient comfort level on exploring trials.
There is, and it's an interesting question. It's worth starting the equation, just like I'm always careful when I talk about Trial Scout to never criticize clinicaltrials.gov, because I have a deep admiration for that team and for the service they provided. Similarly, there are no black hats in any part of this story. It's the problem is simply that your primary care physician is extremely busy, right? Overworked, and really there's just too much flow. Yeah. Secondly, if you didn't do research as a resident or a fellow, you have left that process, that bubble behind. And if you're not doing it in your own practice, or you didn't bring that with you, you may be decades out from the last time you connected with the research infrastructure of the country. And so there are these sort of systemic things that are sort of sitting between not the patient in the trial, but the referring physician for the trial. And then the last part of it is that working off of, above all, do no harm. It's very difficult to recommend something to a patient when you don't know what that thing is, when you don't know the protocol, you don't know the investigators, you don't know what their motivations are. It's just very difficult. So the default position is to stick to what people already know, which is qualified standard of care. And there's nothing wrong with giving people the standard of care. We know it's safe. We've validated it in clinical trials. So the challenge is that the science doesn't advance. And when you look at what's happened in oncology in the last 5 years, that was built off of the backs of the academic medical centers really being able to recruit into those spaces. But now everybody is benefiting from them. But that, when you're talking about standard of care, you're talking about medicine that's been validated for about 10 years, right? So there are these therapies that show up and they change the game. And it is important to at least provide the opportunity to understand that choice and maybe even facilitate the logistics for all of us, because that would shorten the timeline in drug discovery by years if we could pull that off.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a parallel to a book called the Sushi Economy, which was written about how sushi went from being this thing that you could get in a marketplace in Japan or in various places on the coast to, a deli in Ohio in the middle of the week, regardless of when and where anything came from. So this is something where, you have this resource and you have the availability of being able to get into a clinical trial that used to be limited to these larger recruiting centers, and now theoretically can be dispersed just about anywhere because you have much more reach and people can get much more familiar with them.
Yeah, that's great framing. I would just add to that the most in both cases it's a supply chain problem that you're solving for. In the case of bringing sushi to Dayton and bringing a clinical trial to a non-academic space, it's about solving the supply chain, de-risking it, and standardizing the experience. You're absolutely right. That's a great analogy.
Yeah, that's excellent. So at some point though, you got to the point with the company where, so just as background, you weren't the original CEO, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And you got to the point in the company where, you kind of saw where you thought the company should go, and it kind of wasn't going there. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because this forum, we usually have a lot of people in early stage companies, and a lot of times this is geared towards people that are starting their own ventures. And one of the things that, is really important to get into is, the experience of, not everything goes perfectly the same time, and not everything is just an exponential growth story. Sometimes there's rocks in the road. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And you put that mental image. I think it's an XKCD comic where it's like what people think success looks like, and then what it ends up accidentally over here. Yeah. So I'm Circuit's founder, but for 2 years we were lucky enough to have leadership that had experience in running large companies. And the only challenge that comes out of those situations is that alignment is the most important thing. If you're founding a young company or trying to get something done in an early stage company, the thing you should come to work every day focused on is making sure that you and your entire leadership team are strongly aligned on what the company is, what it's trying to become, and how does it get there. My team has heard this so often that I can feel them rolling their eyes when I say this to the next new team, that I only ask myself 3 questions as I drive into work. What game are we playing? What's the score? How do we win? Right? So if you can narrow your focus in those ways, it's important. So at about maybe a 2.5 year mark, the board just said that, hey, listen, we're looking to do these innovative things in both clinical trial access, that's Circuit's broader network of physician practices that participate, and digital engagement to facilitate that. That was Trial Scout. And we'd like you to think about stepping up now and sort of running the company to build that version of the company. So I can tell you, I'm like you, Derek, I'm a voracious reader, right? And I love reading startup stories. And if you're thinking about an early stage company, founding one, or you are running one, there is no reason to make the same mistakes the rest of us have, right? They're all written down and well laid out. And what you'll find is the more of these you read and talk to your friends who are running early stage companies, they're doing the exact same thing and having the exact same. There is a deep structure to this whole process. I think a great book I finished this year was Lost and Founder. And of course, the all-time classic is Ben Horowitz's The Hard Thing About Hard Things.
Oh, that book is great.
Yeah, do not start a company. Everybody who asks me about this, they get a gift from me. The next day I send them a copy of The Hard Thing About Hard Things. nobody interested in founding a company should take step one until they read this book, because it is prescient how eerily, he is on the spot about, not about what exactly will happen to you, but how what happens will make you feel, and what you'll need to kind of go through to kind of break through and achieve success and keep your sense of humor and keep your family intact and all that good stuff. It's a great book. And so
he actually wrote a follow-up to that was basically, I forget what it was called, but it was basically being married as a founder, right? What founding a company does to your marriage and one-off relationships. And it's really a challenging thing that most people, I think a lot of people fall in love with the romantic vision of the startup, right? You start a company, difficult things happen that you somehow magically get through, and then 3 years later, it's always 2 or 3 years later, there's either an IPO or something that involves a private jet, right? And unfortunately, statistically, that is not the expected outcome. Bill Gates ruined it for everybody. If you take the expected value of a startup, it's net positive if you leave all of those billions in there. But honestly, it's much harder, and that's not the likely result that ever happens.
Oh, I tell it, my physician friends don't like it when I say this, but I point out that I have 10 years of postgraduate training under my belt, right, in a city hospital, right? So this is qualitatively the hardest thing I've ever done. But hard things aren't necessarily bad things. I mean, it's also the most fun I've ever had too. So it is a very particular thing. And I loved how you framed the start of this thread was what's your why? And I think that's what's important, right? There are lots and lots of great ways to be, financially successful and emotionally successful in the world. Great companies are founded, they're organized around something larger than the individual, right? The idea is, when I look at my board and I look at Circuit's leadership team, and most importantly, the actual boots on the ground people who, our clinical team is out in the world right now in the era of COVID taking care of people. It's absolutely astonishing. It's a tremendous responsibility for sure, but it's a lot of fun to think that you get to work with people that talented, that brave, that smart every day. It's good stuff.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, you also have the benefit of having a really good board, and you've had really good people around you. One of the things that I wanted to get into a little bit is, you have the benefit of having been in, Buffalo's environment for a while, and also a bit of a taste of New York City as well. And, I imagine not everybody knows about 43 North terribly well, although we are a bit more familiar with Labs, and you have the benefit of having participated in both. So do you want to talk a little bit about, how both of those have helped you on the journey?
Absolutely. And I think maybe there is a note for anybody listening in terms of early stage companies, because there's a lot of support in New York State. Governor Cuomo's done an amazing job over the last 5 or 6 years of really trying to look at sort of how do we turn New York State into an innovation economy. And so we've been, I might be a biased reviewer here because I'm a beneficiary of almost every program created, right? Circuit, a member of Startup New York, which was critical. We received a great opportunity through University of Buffalo Institute of Genomics. And that was, Dr. Christina Orsi and Dr. Norman Nowak running that provided a real opportunity for Circuit in its early days. That was also state funded. Labs is there in partnership with Empire State Development, and Empire State Development's projects. I don't think just for Circuit. I think they've had an impact. So we were really excited this year to start our Labs Residency. It's a wonderful space. It gives us a presence in Manhattan. It gives us, and that is, I'm down in the city before all of this happened. You and I were meeting on a near, bi-weekly basis kind of thing. So I'm down there all the time. It's where our clients are. It's where there's a lot of opportunity to grow. But certainly the jewel in the crown in 2019 was being named a finalist at 43 North. And for those of you who don't know, that's New York State's really, it's a kind of a love letter to innovation. And so it's a business plan competition looking for startups, early stage startups that have achieved traction. Market traction seems to be the defining characteristic. They can come from any position. I think we were one of 2 upstate companies to make the semis or make the finals, I think it was, and we were the only one that was an award winner. And we were the only life science company in that batch. So it's literally, if you're starting any kind of company, it's a great competition, and the prizes can't be beat. I mean, it's the top prize won by our friends over at Strauss was $1 million over a year. We won $500,000 over a year. So you can see these are huge impact prizes. Most importantly, you get the whole 43 North kind of infrastructure behind you. It's run by Colleen Heidinger over there, and she does an amazing job. The team is just stacked with talent. Lauren Rivette, who runs the portfolio. You get top end talent helping you press and public relations with Mara Devlin. So it's been really, really a unique experience. It's not your typical incubator where you just you've got some office space. You have office space. Buffalo's tallest building is Seneca 1, and so we have the 24th floor over there. Beautiful views. I remember them well for the short time we were in there before the whole thing got locked down. But in the absence of that, through the lockout, you really see what the impact of being in a strong incubator is that 43 North has continued to provide Circuit with tremendous services in terms of support for our ongoing programs, graphic design help, and it's a very, very powerful thing that when I meet my friends downstate who haven't heard of 43 North and who are starting companies, I'm like, what you really want to do is look at this hard because it's been great for us, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's really terrific to hear. I mean, it's, New York has, people sometimes don't realize how big New York is. I mean, I think the Buffalo region, the Long Island region, and New York City in different states would be kind of the main game all on their own. Yep. And we have these things that are all pretty high-powered innovation engines. They're all terrifically active. They're reasonably geographically disparate, but it's really amazing to have all of that under one roof. Can you talk a little bit about how, did being in Buffalo initially kind of, help in terms of how you were able to get either initial clients, how you were able to get access to any patients, or kind of build up a little bit of, say, customer reputation or initial users?
Without a doubt, on a couple levels. On the business level, it helped because we were beneficiaries of all those early projects. It really allowed us to kind of figure out what we were doing. We ended up being a member of Startup New York, which gave us housing in this beautiful building in downtown Buffalo. That was our first incubator space. But really what that did was connect us to the university. And that was a chance to work with Dr. Norman Nowak, to work with, that whole team that ended up. Then in fact, one of our board members came from there. We were introduced to Andy Brooks while we were over there. And then on the other side, it definitely helps. The two paradoxes of running a startup are that if you can't win at home, nobody's interested. But as soon as you win at home, nobody's going to count it in your favor either. Well, of course you did that. That's where you're supposed to win, right? So you just have to maintain, that's the game. You have to win at home, but do not think that because you've won at home that any out-of-town VC thinks that that's an accomplishment. You also have to be able to show how that can scale. What you're trying to show is, look, we won here where we should have won, and we won, definitively. We have 28 physician practices of every kind that have signed deals with us. We're partnered with Roswell Park. We're partnered with the University of Buffalo. We're partnered with the Buffalo Institute of Genomics. So we've managed to become part of the clinical trials infrastructure of upstate New York in a relatively short period of time. But what we've done is do it in a way where we say, and this is how this goes to Albany and to Rochester and eventually across the country. That's the interesting part about what Circuit's network does. And obviously Trial Scout is already live across the country, but that was all built in upstate New York. I mean, Trial Scout was built as a result of two Center for Advanced Technology grants. I almost forgot those. We applied for and were awarded 2 matching grants. So, we certainly put more than that money into it, but that's what funded us doing the data reconstruction of the clinicaltrials.gov data set. So, you're very much you need to know where you live and what's available around you. And I'm still astonished when I meet friends who are starting companies in Buffalo who haven't thoroughly explored these things, because there's a lot of infrastructure support, and you can scale that by 10 inside New York City. There's lots of stuff around if you know where to look.
Yep.
We, NewYorkBIO actually lobbied hard this year to maintain funding for the Centers for Advanced Technology. They were trying to do some significant cuts. So
I saw that too, and I spoke on its behalf. And I think Dr. Nowak, when she was speaking to the assembly, used Circuit as an example to say, we're unapologetic about it. If it wasn't for the programs that New York State, through Empire State Development and through the governor's office, had put in place to spur innovation and really get startups going, Circuit would be in Denver. I was actually looking for a house in Denver back in 2015 because our VC partners, at KMG Capital Partners, are based in Denver, and the idea was that we'd move there. And then a couple of things just happened, one domino after another. We got into Startup New York. We got this really excellent, beautiful timing for a young company, an incentive proposal from the Buffalo Institute of Genomics. And it was really Buffalo taking a chance at sort of saying, we know startups are a long shot, but we think that you'll do the right thing and you have roots here. I sit on the board of our Catholic school that my girls go to, that kind of thing. We think there's a chance where this could be a good thing for Buffalo, a good thing for Circuit, and obviously a good thing for New York State if it grows. And so if it wasn't for those programs, I'm certainly be in Denver right now, which is, I'm glad we're not. I love Denver, but I'm glad I'm in Buffalo.
Well, we're glad you stayed. Yep. Well, we're glad we kept you. So you've stayed, you've gotten some things that kind of helped you along on the journey. What are some of kind of the defining wins or things where you kind of either became a bigger player or that the folks on the investment side really saw as kind of big stakes in the ground, like, yeah, this is real, this is where there's growth, that kind of thing. So it's either our kind of big kind of partnerships, big kind of contracts, what are the things that really kind of solidified the place where you are now? And if you could give everybody kind of a sense of really where you are now, kind of how widely is Trial Scout used, how many trials is it in, and just a scope of what kind of reach does the company have now?
Yep, absolutely. And I'll start by putting this into context, right? We're still very much an early stage company, right? We're still in our scale phase. In fact, we'd like to think we're at the bottom of the J, but I'm sure that's where every founder I've ever met believes they are, right? Whether we're right or wrong. So,
you're poised for the exponential.
Right. I could be wrong. That's the caveat here. But we have a certain set of proof points that are really, the kinds of things that have companies optimistic about that they have learned a few things along the way. We've made plenty of mistakes, and we're okay with that. We're from the Steve Jobs school that mistakes will get made because decisions get made. And at Circuit, we're quite comfortable taking action and sort of learning as we go from those actions. And that's been a very successful play for us. So, we do a few things, right? We are a decentralized clinical trials network. We bring research into healthcare spaces and we operationalize those spaces to do it. And we built the first ever ratings and reviews platform for clinical trial sites. So the Yelp of clinical trials. And it was aimed initially to sort of help that patient journey towards it. And then what we learned was that the kinds of data we were collecting also let us help people running clinical trials understand if patients were getting dissatisfied or looking to drop out and stuff. And from there, an enterprise solution emerged in the last year that's been successful. So that's our work. And then when you look at sort of why do we think we're at that next phase, or we're poised for that next phase, is that we now have more than 40 projects from top 20 pharma and CROs kind of under our belt and are in active execution. The kind of work we do is really well positioned for where the market is going, where the clinical trials market is going to have to go. Between digital engagement of patients and really measuring satisfaction as they go through the place, and then providing new places where research can happen, whether it's tele at home or in the office of their doctor's office, rather than just in these silos where it's been done traditionally. So that has us feeling optimistic. We weren't built for COVID, but we were built sort of for where the clinical trials market would go. As a result of COVID-19, that future is here. Like we're all trying to adapt to it right now. And then the third part of that is that it's adoption. It's all about adoption. Do people who don't need to do anything new, are they interested in trying what you're offering them? And can you execute once you get the opportunity? So we have a lot of repeat business from pharma and CROs, Trial Scouts, widespread adoption. We offered a freemium model to get sites to use the process, thinking we took it to the Society for Clinical Research Sites meeting in Orlando, I think it was in Orlando last year. And we thought out of the 500 sites, if we ended up signing up 20, that was a win. It was a good signal we're on the right track. And we have about 210 of them in queue right now. So, with a bunch of them some of the largest site networks in the country are using the platform. So that's a unique situation for a scaling startup. And so those are
that's more than 20.
Yeah, right. So
that's more than 20.
Exactly. So, I look at it like there's still lots to do, and that's a good problem. I'll take that problem every day of the week, but we are well positioned to solve real problems for patients. And anytime you can solve problems for patients in clinical trials, that's valuable for everybody.
Yeah. You mentioned both in our conversation before and earlier here, you mentioned trust, which I think comes up over and over again. And, I think if you think about where the biotechnology industry sits in terms, somehow in terms of national opinion, I think a lot of this stuff hinges on trust. And, I think one of the really interesting things that you've done is kind of brought the patient experience front and center and really thought about how they could tell their stories about how they, actually engage in the process. So it gives it a little more of an in-person feel. Like if your neighbor was involved in a clinical trial and they told you about it, that builds a little more recognition in terms of you. So it's almost kind of democratizing that around patients and, getting some of that trust a little further out into the open.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you can't really have trust unless you have transparency, right? I think those two elements are the two sides of a coin that you can think of as respect, right? So, it really boils down to this: that if we want, the way we think about trust is that it's the gate price for engagement, and so, as we think about this in terms of how do you get patients more engaged, I think we start with asking ourselves, what is engagement? And if we look at what's been done previously, there's a couple things it isn't, right? Engagement is not a push where I, as a pharmaceutical company, as a sponsor of a trial, or I, as the health system running a trial, or as an investigator at a site, I send out an email to my team, to my patients in this trial, with some sort of, branded content about what we do and letting them know about the trial. That's not engagement, right? We know the open rates are less than 3% in great email campaigns. We know that the response rate's even lower than that, right? So that is not engagement. And we also know that engagement is not a pull. It's not sending, hey, here's a survey for you to complete. We really want your opinion. And then that information comes in and it goes over a wall and nobody learns anything. The person offering the insights in the hopes that it would have an impact doesn't get to see what the benefit of sharing that information is. That's obviously a problem broadly in clinical trials where people participate, but they often don't get any news in terms of what happened with the study itself. And so engagement is not either a push or a pull. We look at it as it's a two-way conversation, and engagement is a conversation. And if you want to have engagement, truly people who are motivated, who understand their why for your clinical trial and all the rest of that stuff, then you need to create a space where that can happen. And that was really some of our thinking along this, is that's the powerful part about ratings and reviews. And this isn't our thinking. It's been proven by Yelp, by Google Reviews, by TripAdvisor. So then the question becomes, well, why have something for the clinical trial community? But, we have, Google exists and TripAdvisor is doing just fine. And the reason for that is that people want a domain-specific search experience. If you're looking to you've either been in a trial and you want your voice heard, or you're looking for a trial for yourself or your loved one, there needs to be a space where you can see what other people like you, thought about it, what they went through, and all the rest of that stuff. And that's very powerful stuff. That's the beginning of letting a site, for example, have a conversation with their teams. And certainly we've scaled that up to the enterprise level to sort of say, here's how you build engagement with the sites and the people who are coming to these sites. And here's how you can learn who's at risk to drop out, or what the problem is in your study that's brewing here, those kinds of things. That's a very different thing than hey, listen, here's some phenomenal looking art and $2 million in Google and Facebook ads to help people find your study. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a very interesting, important part of the awareness phase of it. But after awareness, you need decision support, and you need choice, and you need choice architecture and those kinds of things. So I think we've been good at solving for the first part of, could we roughly make globally people aware of clinical trials? We've been doing that for 30 years, and it's got its results, and sometimes it's effective and sometimes it isn't, but there's a lot more to it. And if we really want to change how people choose trials and stuff like that, I think we're going to all get very comfortable. I think 2 years ago when we were talking about Trial Scout, a lot of my friends in pharma would push back and say, I'm not sure we really want the patient's voice out there in the wild. And I remember one of them happened the day before we launched Trial Scout. I go, I've got very bad news for you. I want it out there. I definitely want it out there, and I just spent a lot of money. It's definitely coming.
I hate to break it to you.
And instantly, the response changed from, well, now that this exists, how do we engage with it? And how do we work productively in that space? And that's always the way of these things, right? Then it takes time, and then it takes building trust with your clients too, which is that, look, nobody's here to hurt the sites or to hurt the clinical trials industry. I only left medicine to do this in order to accelerate the clinical trials industry. And so it becomes about saying there is a need for patients to get more support. They need the awareness help, but then they need the help choosing the thing, and then they need more places to participate. And I think that's one of the things that'll come out of COVID, is that everybody has learned that optimizing for the patient experience at home, and also in terms of where they want to move around to, that's going to be who are the winners. The winners will be the ones who goes ahead solves for that.
And
Well,
you see some of this data also providing the ability for sponsors and investigators to even change the way going forward they interact, right, with patients in the trial based on some of that feedback.
Could you repeat the question again, Jennifer?
Yeah. Do you think that the information that the sponsors and the investigators glean from the reviews, if you will, right, on Trial Scout, will that change how they approach their interactions with patients going forward?
That's the goal. And so how do you get to that goal? You just described the ideal state. Could we create a world in which, or a process or a platform in which people could provide carefully architected answers to, so you know, what we don't want is a bunch of people unblinding themselves or talking about SAEs in an open space like that. So Trial Scout is designed to be architected in a way to prevent that from happening. Nothing gets live, it goes through a tank, it gets QA'd, NLP, all that good stuff. So there's a whole set of, you know, stage gates you have to put in there to make it a safe space to have those conversations. But if all it did was give people a way to see their review online and let somebody else see it, that's a win for sure. It's a 10x improvement of where we are right now, but it's not as interesting as what sits behind Trial Scout. So, you know, I like to think that good design is making something complicated look very simple. I think Trial Scout's interface it should be simple, and if it isn't, if anyone's, you know, donking around in it and doesn't like it or thinks it's complicated, send me an email or Irfan@circuitclinical.com. We want to know, right? So, but it's at least we've tried to make it pretty user friendly and intuitive. The back end is obviously a data engine beast, and what it's trying to do is at the enterprise solution, what we think is an interesting thing to do is, could you follow people's satisfaction over time in their trial? And could you use the things that computers do well to identify who is growing dissatisfied or who had a bad experience that day that might impact their understanding of the trial, their motivation to continue, things like that. And so that's what we spent a lot of our time doing. And we're very excited about sort of, you know, what the enterprise solution can show, even in the early work we've been doing around our own network, is that this is a good way to get distant early warning and to impact compliance and to impact motivation and to learn, frankly, most importantly, to learn from patients. I've been a PI in a bunch of heart failure trials, and certainly as a fellow, I was part of two of the longest lasting, you know, clinical trials in cardiology. I mean, I think I started one as an intern and it finished when I was a fellow, kind of thing. And we all dreaded it, right? Because it was never going to end. And it ended up changing the entire defibrillator practice patterns. And so what we learned was that there are things that happen in a trial that patients find odious, but they don't complain about, they just put up with. But it slows the ability to get that one person through the entire trial. They'll miss visits. They'll stay in the game, but they're dragging their feet a little bit. And we're not learning anything. We're not learning how to make it better for them. Whereas there is that opportunity to do that. So that's what we've been oriented around, Jennifer. I think you're right. That's the exact ideal state to get to. Can you ask questions that make you smarter at the level of design, implementation, and those kinds of things? And that's exactly it.
Can you talk a little bit about what kind of trials and what kind of areas are really the most fragile in terms of patient dissatisfaction? Where are the places where the industry could do a lot better, right? The patient experience isn't very good, and you know, obviously there are a lot of places that have these huge unmet needs. And what are some of the places where, you know, just improving that patient experience could maybe lower some of that dissatisfaction? I mean, closing a trial is incredibly difficult, but what are some of the areas that are really fragile in your estimation?
Yeah, and I guess I'll start with the banal observation that nobody ever sits down to write a protocol to torment people, right? They're not trying to make these awful experiences. These are, you know, a bad experience, I like to think, is an emergent property. It emerges from the complexity of what we're trying to learn, the complexity of the disease we're trying to fight, really, and then the complexity of human-human interactions, right? So from those three things kind of bonking together, we're going to get some emergent properties, and one of them is if we don't architect for it, we end up with these experiences where the human being who's trusting, you know, everybody in that chain, the investigator, the coordinators, the site, the sponsor, the CRO, everybody, to do a really great job of thinking about, hey, how does this feel? Like, how does this genuinely feel? Because that's in everybody's interest. If it feels terrible, the dropout rate's going to be high. And I'm not talking about situations where people can't tolerate the medication, right? We know that, you know, if we say the dropout rate across the board is about 1 in 4, probably half that bucket, they're going to drop out. They can't tolerate the medication, they're having side effects, drug-drug interactions, something, they're going to go. There's 50% that are in play, and in some studies it might be much larger than that. And it's about understanding, why do they leave? And the truthful answer is, we don't really know. Ken Getz has done a nice job over at SysScript, really nice job of really shining a flashlight into the world of clinical trials. I think the work that the Tufts team does at SysScript is really a public service, honestly, and it's inspired a lot of the work that we do. And yet even there, we're limited by, we have one center studying this hard and going after trying to understand what could be done, but it's looking at it from a global level, therapeutic area by therapeutic area, and sort of the industry as a whole. And I think that what we're going to learn here from the enterprise solution is that every study has got its own kind of, it's got its own challenges, right? Well-designed, great patient experience studies, they're like happy marriages, right? Chekhov's happy marriages. They're all the same. They've all figured out some core ideas, and all the ones that are in trouble, they're unhappy in their own ways, right? So the key is, so are there some space that people know they're going to be able to enroll? Sure. I was just talking about this with friends in design, and they're like, yeah, a diabetes trial, that's going to enroll. A stage 4 cancer trial where the impact is absolutely like last option, it's going to enroll. Sadly, even in that situation, they're probably only accessing 10% of the patients in the country who could enroll, just because of the existing infrastructure, but they're going to enroll. And so where we see huge opportunities are, what about studies in ulcerative colitis or in chronic diseases that will require a study that spans a year and a half, maybe 2 years, cardiovascular disease, where we're looking for outcomes. It's an incident-driven study, so it may take years and years. Those studies are very vulnerable to dissatisfaction, to loss of interest, those kinds of things. And then I think the flip side is how do you improve engagement, right? So in rare diseases, you could say, well, these are desperate patients and they definitely want to be part of this trial, but they have to find their way to the trial too. And that, for them, I think for that group, the oncology rare diseases, they need tools that help with awareness and engagement. And then in terms of the really, where is the vulnerable trial? I think the vulnerable trial is the longer it goes, the more procedures it has, and the, put it this way, the less a priori defensibility it's got for keeping people engaged. That's also pretty vulnerable too. So in other words, if you haven't thought about how do you prevent somebody from dropping out, getting dissatisfied or bored or busy, that's the number one thing.
Okay. So we have a question from somebody. It was a while ago, but now seems a more appropriate time to ask it. And the question is, this person was approached by a nonprofit group from the Middle East seeking clinical trial programs for pediatric oncology. And they said from the program, their leader commented that the domestic medical programs were applying older and dramatic surgical solutions rather than other forms of therapeutics. And they were seeking advanced US treatments for a wider variety of pediatric oncology found in the clinical trials. And they said, does your system handle that? And in a situation like that, who either maintains the data quality or the access to medicines for the program? It's a pretty sprawling question, but broadly, there are places internationally that struggle with access to medicine and kind of adhering to the same types of things that we do, especially in areas like pediatric oncology.
So we don't do any peds-onc right now. We took 4 years to sort of get very good at 8 other therapeutic areas that we thought had structural similarities, deep structural similarities. Started in cardiovascular, which I knew I knew very well. I felt pretty good that I could run a cardiovascular trial, and then slid over into general medicine, things like that. And we had opportunities to partner in oncology a lot sooner than we did. And we had people asking us, including investors, why aren't we in that space when it's profitable and it's interesting and it's very high prestige? And we said the answer was because we want to make sure we're ready to go ahead and do that. And about 3 years ago, we felt like, we're getting there. We're going to be ready. So we approached our friends over at Roswell Park, which is obviously an NCI cancer center. And over the next, call it a year and a half, we built a partnership that we think is quite exciting, where we can take Roswell Park clinical research and bring it out to outpatient settings that they have command and control over. So we're a facilitator of Roswell Park oncology. Certainly, we have plenty of friends of ours on the pharma and CRO side that would like us to be doing more oncology driven clinical trials for sponsors. And so we're working on that as well. So we see all this stuff coming online in the next year or so. I will say that that's a great question though, because I think that is a use case for clinical trials, is that it provides care options for people who either can't afford or can't get access to them. And I'll end on sort of a hopeful but realistic note. that in situations like that, what's changed in the last 5 years are that concierge travel services exist. And so Greenfire, for example, is we know the team there. Full disclosure, I own no stock in the company or anybody, no affiliations with them whatsoever, but I like the company. And they started inpatient payments, but they do cool stuff with concierge travel, as do a bunch of other companies in this space. And so that's become a thing, is getting that patient who might be on the other side of the world, but who qualifies for a study, to the study itself. And there are sponsors that are motivated to make that happen. It's in everybody's interest. It speeds the enrollment. It might prove the cure, all those good things. So some of this may just be a question of connecting those places with the existing U.S. Clinical research infrastructure, the oncology collaboratives and consortiums that are out there. And so there's ways to potentially solve for that problem, but the differential in care is a real problem. It's a real problem in the U.S., let alone around the world. And so that was that question's taken well. I mean, it's right on point.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a two-parter. All right, you have two different scenarios, and in the first scenario, you're the founding CEO of a startup company with basically a new method of action in cancer or something like it that could be groundbreaking, and you don't even have a drug in clinicals yet. What do you do as that CEO to better engage with patients, and how do you set yourself up for clinical success? And just so you know the other side of the question that's coming, put yourself in the shoes of a CEO at one of the top 10 biopharma companies. How do you look at what they do clinically? And how would you either do something different, or how would you position them for the next decade of clinical research?
Sure. So from the small or virtual pharma side, I think the very first step is the deep structure of business hasn't changed industry to industry. That's relatively the same, right? There's only really 4 different kinds of platform technology models. They were all taken from existing marketplaces. So I would say it all starts with customer discovery. So if you think you have a therapeutic, it's sort of like the idea that Einstein said if he had an hour, he'd spend 58 minutes on working on what the problem is, what's the right question to ask, and the solution will declare itself in 2 minutes. I don't know if that's true, but I know it's a better use of time. I definitely know I know it's definitely a better use of your time to spend 58 minutes thinking on who is the customer that's out there, who's that patient out there that I'm trying to help, and what have they already assumed. You can assume that group, if it realizes it's a group, it's a cohort, it's created some infrastructure around itself. So I think it's about customer discovery followed quickly by customer engagement. So it's really about, have they created any networks of their own? Because those grassroots networks are incredibly powerful in terms of sharing information that's trusted, that's seen as unbiased, and they can make powerful introductions. We've benefited from this over and over again with the nonprofits that are out there doing really great work. I think the other side of the equation is that, no matter how good you are at recruiting, the smartest people in the world statistically are outside your company, right? So you want to make as many friends as you can, right? So I think an organization like Bio, for example, and I won't pander here, so I'll also mention MedTech, but the idea is that these kinds of networks are critical to scaling your business, because there's no way what the answer is. There's just statistically, it's unlikely that you know exactly who can help you. But what you do know is how to meet people who might know who can help you. So, you mentioned Circuit's board, right? The number of times I've had VCs ask, how does an early stage company stack like this with this kind of a board? And we'll have another announcement out here shortly to prove that this is a replicable phenomenon we've gotten very good at, which is, if you are the kind of person who wants very smart people to tell you when you're making mistakes, smart people will spend a little time telling you what you're getting wrong, right? And that's how I'm wired, and I think that's how every good CEO should be wired. So to get to those patients to start deciding, is there a market here for the therapeutic I'm working on? Is this therapeutic solving a problem? Or what have been the other part of this is to ask those patients, what do you hate about the medications you're currently taking, for example? Or where is this therapeutic failing you? You're going to identify the gap. I think that's the real problem, right? What I think my friends who are, I've been lucky enough now to meet a lot of great VCs. And if they have one thing in common, regardless of where they did their MBA or their finance degrees, they're all really good at asking themselves, is this person solving a real problem? Like, let's say they're successful and they figure out how to do all this stuff and their therapeutic works and is that a problem that anybody will care about? Or is that just another part of kind of this big mosaic of drugs that don't have much differentiation? So is that that's me answering part one. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely.
Part two, I think, is completely different because it's got all the asset power, right? So if you're running a large company, you know, what I'll say is that you know, I'll call out with the caveat that you know, we've done business for them, so clearly I've got some conflicts here, right? But I do think there's something kind of romantic and cool about Vertex Pharmaceuticals, right? Like, it's gone after super hard problems. I mean, and it's gone after them with their own molecules, like stuff they invent and then take all the way through the production line. And they do all this innovative stuff. I mean, they're maybe the most virtually comfortable large pharma I've ever seen. And I'll just put it that way, that's a replicable model, a way of thinking about innovation, which is that, no, yes, we could just be a distribution channel. We could buy this company, roll it into our situation, and then broadcast the message. I'm glad there are companies like that. I mean, you know, Pfizer's probably the best example of really being great at being able to identify an asset that could be commercialized if it was scalable. But it would be great to see the companies that have huge resources. And I think we're seeing this now in the era of COVID. Everybody's gotten back into, no, we have the resources, we have the scientists, we'll develop the drugs, right? Like, we're seeing tons and tons of companies step up and say, we know how to do this. And hopefully that kind of takes us back into another renaissance of the large companies actually putting together their own molecules, spending the time in R&D and putting that infrastructure together. That would be great for all of us because they have the most know-how in terms of how to do this. They're also just excellent at the other thing, which is identifying early stage companies, scaling them up and stuff. I just think that it might shorten the pipeline if we had some of the heavy hitters really spending a lot of time on novel development. But
yeah, I'm
a drug development guy, so what do I know?
Yeah, that's all right. But one of the things that's been really nice to see is the way that the industry has stepped up in response to COVID. The number of people that, you know, everyone that's in the game of large vaccines has stepped up with their own vaccine programs. You have folks like Regeneron that, you know, somehow are going to have an antibody in the clinic less than 6 months after basically the discovery of the virus. It's been incredible. And then, you know, and Bill Gates, not to be outdone, is setting up everything he can for multiple vaccine production and manufacturing facilities, which in and of itself is simply amazing. So that's been, you know, certainly from our position, that's been amazing to watch. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I don't know if there are any other questions from the audience, but we can really kind of pick a topic of your choosing for how to bring it home, right? So you're looking at the way that clinical development shapes up over the next decade. You're in wonderfully positioned in terms of having that voice of the patient. You know, project out 10 years. You know, how many more clinical trials are conducted on, you know, a dispersed fashion, right? How much faster is it? Where are the big things that we're going to see over the next decade?
I think so. You know, let me start in reverse order. I think we will see, you know, 5 to 10 years from now, a sizable percentage of the market is looking for decentralized options. I think some of that's going to be virtual. I'm not sure it's going to be virtual for the entire trial, but I think what we'll see is choice and flexibility is going to be a major part of study design going forward. I think that sponsors are going to want to know that they can de-risk the enterprise. God forbid, should there be another one of these, you know, types of outbreaks. And I think all of us statisticians are like, there's going to be another one of these types of outbreaks. And so the second time around, we will have no excuse not to be, you know, ready to roll and have our systems in place. And so what we don't want to see is what we've got right now, which is kind of the clinical trials, drug discovery apparatus of the entire country and the world kind of on hold as it reconfigures. And so I think going forward, what we'll have is, my guess is that companies that can offer sponsors, pharmaceutical companies that can offer them flexibility that, look, here's your design. We're going to do these, you know, these 10 visits in the office as planned. And should there be an issue, we can pivot to these ones over at their doctor's office, these ones virtual. That, I think that's going to be a powerful, compelling space. I think 5 years out, it will be standard. If you can't offer a client that, then they're going to see it as a more risked option. If you're just saying, hey, here's my brick and mortar research factory and we're going to do all the research here, that's going to be less appealing. So geographic distribution, decentralization, those are going to be important. I think digital engagement and really being able to prove that should something happen to your patient, you're getting distant early warning, and you're going to be able to keep people, you're going to at least be able to understand and talk to them and engage them while they're either upset or dissatisfied or any of those things, to ameliorate that. I think that'll become a very standard part of what the clinical trials journey looks like. I think it's going to be more decision support, more peer-to-peer. There's 5 million Americans within the last 10 years have been in a clinical research project of one kind or another. That's a cohort, and they have no place to talk to each other, right? So I think we will see them align themselves not just as, oh, this is my disease and this is who I hang out with. They'll be like, no, I was in a clinical trial and I want to help the next person thinking about a clinical trial choose it. So that's a lot of the work that we do with our Find the Five campaign, is about really engaging those people and trying to learn from them. I think that's going to be even more ubiquitous. That's not unique to us. As soon as that cohort starts to identify itself, there's going to be a lot of great solution providers who want to be part of that conversation. I will say right now, I think if the past is prologue, what's happening right now will shortly be the past, and it will absolutely be prologue shortly. And I think that what it's telling us is that right now, every clinical trial is in rescue, whether it knows it or not. Every drug discovery program right now, if you have an active trial, it's been disrupted. Everybody's in rescue. And the only path to, that big bubble, they call it the data gap, of this missing information, right? The data gap is measured at 30% and growing. The only solution for the data gap are engaged patients, because they're the whole point of this thing. And getting those patients to understand how important it is that they continue in the trial, understanding what their barriers are now to contributing, given the fact that their worlds have changed, right? All of our worlds have changed. Those are critical points. And so I think companies that are aimed at helping create engaged patients, helping those patients, really give them a voice and stuff like that, that's going to be critically important right now. But I think it's going to be the paradigm that we're all working off of shortly.
Well, that's fantastic, and I think that's a great point to close on. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you to all the attendees and everyone that had thrown questions over the wall to us here. We're excited about this format. In order to keep up the theme of engagement, what we tend to do after these is we post some of the thoughts and some of the links from the conversation on both our LinkedIn page and on Twitter at NewYorkBio. If you don't follow us already, you should. You can also follow both Irfan Khan and Circuit Clinical on Twitter as well. So, Irfan, formally, thank you very much. And Jennifer, if you want to close us out, we can send everybody off on their day.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We're glad you joined us, and we look forward to talking to you next week. All right. Thanks, Irfan. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.